The November rain had turned the roads of eastern France into rivers of mud. On the night of November 8, 1944, 19-year-old Private First Class Robert Bob Hanson climbed down from the back of a 2.5-ton truck near the village of Bezange-la-Grande, northeast of Nancy. He had been in the U.S. Army for less than a year.
If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.
He had never heard a shot fired in anger. Now the sky ahead flashed orange every few seconds as American artillery fired toward the German frontier. The men waiting beside the road looked older than they really were. Their uniforms were torn, their boots caked with clay, and their faces carried the hard expression of soldiers who had already seen too much. One of them looked at the newcomer, saw the clean jacket, the untested eyes, and said quietly, "Stay close. The first week decides if you live." Bob did not fully understand what that meant until dawn. At 5:20 a.m., German artillery began falling into the orchards around the company positions. The shells did not sound like they did in training films. They started with a faint whistle, then a violent crack that seemed to punch the air from his lungs. Dirt and splinters rained onto his helmet. He pressed himself into a shallow foxhole and felt his whole body shake. Back in the United States, he had spent months drilling at Camp Blanding. He had learned to march, clean an M1 Garand, and crawl under barbed wire. But in that first hour on the front line, he learned the most important lesson of all. Combat did not care how prepared he thought he was. The German soldiers across the line had every reason to believe these replacements would be easy targets. Many were veterans of years of war. They had fought in Poland, France, and Russia. They knew what frightened new soldiers looked like. They could often tell from the first exchange of fire whether the enemy had experience. American replacements in late 1944 frequently arrived with little practical knowledge of frontline conditions. To German observers, they appeared nervous, slow, and predictable. Yet what happened next baffled them again and again. Men who seemed helpless on Monday often returned by the weekend moving with confidence, coordinating with artillery, and attacking with surprising skill. Bob Hanson's first day nearly ended before noon. His squad leader, Sergeant Frank DeLuca from New York City, grabbed him by the collar after he raised his head too high above the foxhole. A German sniper bullet snapped through the branches where his helmet had been a second earlier. DeLuca did not shout. He spoke in a low voice and pointed to every mistake. "Keep your silhouette down. Never stare from one place too long. Watch the hedgerow, not the sky. Listen for machine gun bursts and trace their origin." These were lessons no classroom could teach with the same urgency. Every correction was tied directly to survival. That afternoon, Bob watched the veterans work. They moved in short rushes, dropped instantly when fired upon, and spoke with hand signals instead of unnecessary words. They seemed to know where the Germans were before they saw them. To Bob, it looked almost like instinct. In reality, it was experience condensed into habits. The U.S. Army depended on these veterans to pass hard-earned knowledge to replacements as quickly as possible. A new soldier was not expected to master everything alone. He was attached to men who had already survived months of fighting and who understood that teaching him increased everyone's chances of staying alive. On the second day, Bob learned about artillery. The American way of war relied heavily on coordinated fire support. At 9:40 a.m., a German machine gun pinned his platoon in a muddy beet field. The weapon was hidden in a stone barn and swept the ground with accurate bursts. Bob assumed they were trapped. Lieutenant Charles Murray crawled forward with a radio operator and sent a short request. Within minutes, shells from a nearby American battalion began landing with astonishing precision. The first rounds bracketed the target. The next salvo shattered the barn roof. When the firing stopped, the machine gun was silent. To German soldiers, this was one of the most shocking features of the American Army. The Americans did not need every infantryman to become a tactical genius overnight. They gave even junior leaders access to immense firepower. A frightened private could be transformed into an effective soldier if he learned one critical fact. If you identify the threat and report it correctly, artillery will do much of the killing. German officers repeatedly commented on the speed and accuracy of U.S. artillery, especially once American units established communications. Bob spent that night helping Stringfield Telephone wire through wet woods. He began to understand that combat was not chaos alone. Beneath the noise was a system. Forward observers, radio operators, truck drivers, cooks, medics, and engineers all contributed to a structure designed to absorb losses and keep functioning. If one rifleman fell, another took his place. If a squad made a mistake, the lesson spread quickly. This system allowed thousands of ordinary civilians to improve at a pace that seemed almost impossible. On the third day, Bob made his first patrol. The squad moved into a patch of pine forest before dawn. Frost coated the needles. Every breath hung in the air. Sergeant DeLuca showed him how to place his feet slowly, heel barely touching first, and how to freeze when a flare lit the sky. They discovered a recently abandoned German listening post with cigarette butts, ration tins, and footprints leading east. Nothing dramatic happened, but Bob returned with something more valuable than excitement: confidence. The darkness no longer felt completely unknown. Across the line, a German corporal from the 11th Panzer Division might have noticed the change. 3 days earlier, the new American had stumbled and exposed himself. Now he moved cautiously and kept proper intervals. German veterans were accustomed to armies that improved over time, but the speed of American adaptation was striking because it was repeated on a massive scale. Thousands of replacements, many with little prior experience, were fed into units that acted as practical schools under combat conditions. The fourth day brought tanks. 4 M4 Sherman tanks rumbled into position at first light, their engines growling through the mist. Bob had seen tanks in training, but never in battle. He watched infantry and armor coordinate to attack a fortified farmhouse. The Shermans fired high explosive rounds into windows while riflemen advanced along the flanks. German resistance collapsed within minutes. The lesson was immediate and unforgettable. No branch fought alone. Infantry, armor, engineers, and artillery were meant to operate as one. This combined arms approach was another reason German commanders struggled to understand the Americans. Inexperienced infantrymen became effective much faster when supported by tanks, radios, and overwhelming logistics. They were not isolated soldiers forced to solve every problem individually. They were parts of a larger machine that compensated for their inexperience while they learned. On the 5th day, Bob saw the cost of war. During an afternoon attack near the Lorraine Campaign, a mortar shell wounded his closest friend in the platoon, Private Eddie Morales from San Antonio. The medics arrived within minutes, applied bandages, and carried him to an aid station. Bob felt fear, grief, and anger in the same instant. But he also noticed something else. The platoon did not stop functioning. Men shifted positions, redistributed ammunition, and continued the mission. The Army had trained leaders at every level to keep units moving despite casualties. That evening, Sergeant DeLuca sat with the replacements and reviewed the day. He discussed what had gone wrong and what they would do differently next time. This simple practice, repeated throughout the U.S. Army, was one of the hidden engines of rapid learning. Mistakes were analyzed immediately while details were fresh. Good ideas spread from squad to company, from company to battalion, and often through formal reports to higher headquarters. German forces did conduct after-action analysis, but by late 1944 they faced severe constraints. Fuel shortages limited movement. Replacements were often poorly trained and fewer in number. Communications were disrupted by Allied air attacks. Veteran cadres were shrinking. Many units no longer had the resources to institutionalize lessons as efficiently as the Americans. The Wehrmacht still contained highly skilled soldiers, but its ability to regenerate was weakening. On the sixth day, Bob led a fire team for the first time when a corporal was evacuated with trench foot. Snow mixed with rain, and temperatures hovered near freezing. German small arms opened up from a wooded ridge. 6 days earlier, Bob might have frozen in panic. Instead, he directed one man to cover, another to move left, and relayed the target location to his squad leader. The response felt almost automatic. The habits drilled into him by combat and constant mentoring had become part of him. You can almost feel the transformation. The same young man who arrived trembling beside a muddy road was now making decisions under fire. He was still afraid. Every soldier was, but fear no longer controlled him. Experience had organized the chaos into recognizable patterns. Incoming artillery meant take cover and count the interval. Machine gun bursts meant locate, flank, and call support. Flares meant freeze. Tanks meant opportunity. Radios meant help was close. On the seventh day, November 14, 1944, Bob's company attacked a hill overlooking the German border. The ground was slick, visibility poor, and resistance stubborn. Yet the operation unfolded with a confidence he could scarcely believe. The platoon advanced by bounds. Mortars suppressed suspected positions. Engineers cleared mines. Artillery shifted as the infantry moved forward. By afternoon, the hill was in American hands. After the fighting, Bob looked back over the week and understood what the veterans had meant. The first week did decide if you lived, but not because survival was random. It was a brutal period of accelerated education. Every hour taught a lesson, and every lesson was reinforced by men, doctrine, and systems built to turn civilians into soldiers. German observers saw only the results. On Monday, they encountered frightened newcomers. By Sunday, they faced troops who used cover properly, coordinated fire support, and attacked with increasing effectiveness. To many German veterans, it seemed almost unbelievable. How could an army create competent combat soldiers so quickly? The answer began long before men reached Europe. The U.S. Army developed standardized training programs that broke combat into repeatable skills. Recruits practiced marksmanship, small unit tactics, first aid, communications, and weapons maintenance. Training could not replicate battle, but it established a common language. When a sergeant shouted covering fire, every soldier understood his role. When an officer called for a smoke mission, artillery units followed familiar procedures. This standardization reduced confusion and accelerated adaptation. American industry also played a decisive role. The United States produced enormous quantities of radios, vehicles, artillery shells, winter clothing, and replacement weapons. A tactical lesson was useful only if the equipment existed to apply it. If troops learned that frequent radio communication improved survival, radios had to be available. If artillery proved decisive, ammunition had to arrive on time. The American logistical system ensured that lessons were backed by material support. The replacement system, though often criticized, also contributed to rapid learning when integrated into experienced units. New soldiers were rarely left entirely on their own. Squad leaders and platoon sergeants served as instructors under fire. Veterans passed along practical knowledge that had already been tested in Normandy, the Bocage, and the battles across France and Belgium. The officer corps mattered as well. By 1944, many American junior officers had absorbed hard lessons from earlier campaigns in North Africa and Italy. Leaders such as General George S. Patton and General Omar Bradley encouraged aggressive analysis and adaptation. Poor tactics were criticized. Successful methods were shared widely. Units that failed were expected to improve quickly. German generals recognized this trend. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and others respected American industrial strength, but many were especially struck by the enemy's capacity to recover from mistakes. The Americans might perform awkwardly in an initial engagement, but they rarely repeated the same error for long. This pattern was visible during the Normandy campaign after June 6, 1944. U.S. troops initially struggled in the dense hedgerows. German defenders used concealed positions and interlocking fields of fire to inflict heavy casualties. Yet within weeks, American units adapted by employing specialized tank modifications, closer artillery coordination, and improved infantry tactics. What had first been a nightmare terrain became a battlefield the Americans could master. The same learning cycle appeared in the Battle of the Bulge. In December 1944, many U.S. units were surprised by the German attack. Some green formations broke under pressure, but roadblocks were established. Artillery concentrations organized, and reserves rushed into position. American forces absorbed the shock and responded with increasing effectiveness as the battle unfolded. To German soldiers, this resilience was deeply frustrating. Traditional military thinking often assumed that inexperienced troops would remain vulnerable for extended periods. Instead, the Americans compressed the learning process. Fire support, logistics, standardized doctrine, and practical mentorship reduced the time needed to become competent. Bob Hanson lived through the rest of the war. He crossed the Siegfried Line, endured the winter fighting, and entered Germany in 1945. Years later, he would say he learned more in his first week at the front than in all his months of training. He was not minimizing the importance of boot camp. He was describing the final stage of a system designed to turn raw recruits into effective soldiers with extraordinary speed. For the Germans, the transformation seemed almost unnatural. They saw boys arrive frightened and uncertain. They expected these newcomers to remain easy prey. Instead, within days, those same soldiers were using artillery with confidence, coordinating with tanks, and moving like veterans. The change was not magic. It was the result of an army that treated every engagement as a lesson and had the organization to apply what it learned immediately. In the end, this was one of the most powerful advantages the United States possessed during the Second World War. Not just more trucks, more shells, or more aircraft, though those mattered enormously. The deeper advantage was institutional learning. The American Army could take ordinary civilians from farms, factories, and city streets, and in the span of a single terrifying week, begin turning them into capable combat soldiers. Some German officers understood this before the war was over. They realized they were facing an enemy whose strength grew with every battle. Losses that would cripple other armies became lessons absorbed and converted into better tactics. Every setback produced adjustments. Every survivor became a teacher. That is why so many Germans could not grasp what they were seeing. They were not watching men somehow master war in 7 days. They were confronting an entire military system built to accelerate experience. The rookie in the foxhole was only the visible part. Behind him stood instructors, sergeants, radios, artillery battalions, truck convoys, and factories stretching across a continent. On his first night near Bezange-la-Grande, Bob Hanson shook with fear under German shell fire. 1 week later, he climbed a muddy hill toward the border with the confidence of a soldier who understood how to survive. He had not become fearless. He had become educated by combat and supported by a system designed to teach faster than the enemy could adapt. And that was the secret the Germans struggled to understand. America's most dangerous weapon was not hidden in a tank turret or mounted beneath an aircraft wing. It was the ability to learn, correct, and return stronger almost immediately. In a war decided by endurance and adaptation, that invisible weapon proved as decisive as any gun on the battlefield.
If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.